Okay, well, I guess we can start, and then if others join us, we'll include them in the session. So a big welcome to all. Thank you for joining us today to remember the life of Crawford Young. My name is Aili Tripp, and I'll start out by saying a few words about his life, and then it'll be followed by comments by former students of his, and I hope that we'll have time for others to chime in as well. The loss of Crawford hit so many of us very hard at UW-Madison because of the central role he played in our lives, in the Department of Political Science and the African Studies program, and in the broader field of African politics. We miss him dearly, not only because he was an intellectual giant and a pioneer who made major contributions to the study of African politics, but because he was a fine colleague and a friend with enormous integrity. He was generous with his encouragement and support of junior faculty and graduate students. He was especially supportive of women graduate students. His mentorship of younger scholars like myself meant the world to me. Although he sometimes showed his mischievous side where I was concerned, I just would mention one little story. After I got tenure, one evening I was playing the piano and I heard the door slam, a car door slam, and I went outside and it was nobody in sight. And I noticed that Crawford had left a bottle of champagne, but with a card of congratulations, not from himself, but from a fairy, as he put it. So maybe there was a shy, playful side to him. Crawford was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1931, and he lived there until high school when his family moved to Washington, D.C., where his father was appointed to the Federal Reserve during the Eisenhower administration. His mother, Louise Young, was an English professor at the American University and had a strong influence on his interest in the study of politics, having herself written a book on the League of Women Voters and its vital post-suffrage role. Crawford completed his BA at the University of Michigan in 1953 and joined the Army for 2 years. He then worked for 2 years with the International Studies Association in Paris, and there he met and married the love of his life, Becky Young, who sadly passed in 2008. After completing his doctorate at Harvard, Crawford joined the political science department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1963. And if you know Crawford, you will not be surprised to learn that he was tenured only 3 years after being hired. Crawford also taught at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda from 1965 to 66. He served as a dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at l'Université Nationale du Zaire in Lubumbashi from 1975 to 75, and he was a visiting Fulbright scholar in Senegal in the 80s. At UW, Professor Young helped get the African Studies program off the ground after its inception in 1961, and he chaired the Department of Political Science for 2 terms, the first in 1969, and then again from 1984 to 87. He held numerous key administrative posts at UW, including heading the Transportation Demand Management Committee, where his strong advocacy for greater bus use earned him the affectionate appellation from colleagues as the Pol Pot of parking, and this seemed to amuse him greatly. Beyond UW-Madison, he also served as president of the African Studies Association, and he won the ASA Distinguished Africanist Award in 1990. Crawford's productivity throughout his career and even after retirement was remarkable. As most of you know, he published numerous influential monographs, establishing himself as a leading scholar of African politics. The Politics of Cultural Pluralism won ASA's Herskovits Prize, and Young's ability to synthesize the work of others led to 2 award-winning and far-reaching volumes. One, The African Colonial State in Comparative Perspective, and then his tour de force, The Post-Colonial State in Africa. These volumes and others established him, in my view, as the preeminent scholar of the African state. Professor Young's oeuvre, as he liked to call it, also includes numerous other books, notable among them a 700-page history of the Department of Political Science at UW-Madison, and his last labor of love, a book honoring the pioneering efforts of his late wife as a prominent figure in Wisconsin politics. Rebecca Young had served in the Wisconsin State Assembly from 1985 to 97. Crawford was devoted to his wife, and for their entire life together, they had four daughters, one of whom is a leading scholar of Japanese history, Louise Young, who's at UW-Madison and is with us today. Crawford's outstanding reputation as a scholar of African politics naturally drew many PhD students to Madison to study with him. One of his students, Linda Thomas Greenfield, became Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and is now directing the Biden transition team in rebuilding the State Department. Another PhD student, Stephen Morrison, is Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Young trained an entire generation of prominent Africa scholars, among them Michael Schatzberg, George Nzongola Ntalaja, Catharine Newbury, Ed Keller, Gretchen Bauer, John Harbeson, Joel Samoff, Thomas Turner, and Tim Longman, just to name a few. And I'm sorry if I've missed some of you. I'm afraid I will have done so. Crawford retired from the university in 2001, remaining in Madison. In the last years of his life, he lived in the wing of Capitol Lakes, appropriately named North Hall, and he lived there then until his death on January 21st, 2020. So now we'll hear from some of Crawford's former students, and at the end, I will close with a praise poem for Crawford. I should mention that we will be holding a larger conference in his honor at UW-Madison in April 2022. So if you send me your email address, I'll keep you posted. Also, I should mention that Michael Schatzberg wanted very much to be here today, but circumstances did not permit him to join us. And so without further ado, I will turn this over to Scott Straus, who is the co-host of this event.
Good afternoon, and thanks so much, Aili, for doing most of the legwork and putting this together, and for all of you for being here on this sad but appreciative moment. I thought I would reflect on my kind of deep appreciation and gratitude to Crawford in 4 acts. So Act 1, graduate school. I first encountered Crawford virtually, as many graduate students do, in reading his extraordinary Rise and Decline of the Zairian State, co-authored with Tom Turner, in my first year of graduate school at UC Berkeley in a seminar on African politics taught by Dave Leonard and Bob Price. A year or so later, I read The African Colonial State in Comparative Perspective in a seminar taught by René Lemarchand, and then shortly thereafter, preparing for my prelims, his extraordinary review essay in Cahiers d'études africaines on nationalism, ethnicity, and class. I loved these works. They were incredibly formative for me as a graduate student. They were magisterial on the one hand and deeply specific and detailed on the other. Crawford wrote lyrically and beautifully. The works were full of erudition. They were writerly in construction. Who can forget the metaphor of Bulamatari, the crusher of rocks, from both the Zairian State book and especially the African Colonial State. They were also deeply sympathetic. They were works that kind of, I think, showed a care and appreciation and love of Africa in many ways. And they were masters of comparative work, precise, micro-oriented, empirical, but always striving for seeing broader patterns and generality. That to me is one of Crawford's great strengths, an ability to be sweeping and declarative, but always rooted in reality, grounded in place. Act 2, coming to Wisconsin. When I accepted the job at UW-Madison about 17 years ago, someone informally asked me, "Are you replacing Crawford Young, who had recently retired?" And to me, the question was absurd. It was preposterous. Right? First of all, no one could replace Crawford Young. Second of all, I was a starting assistant professor. But in the end, I could not have asked for a more gracious, generous, kind person to welcome me to Madison, even in his retirement. A couple of memories here. When he learned that I was teaching an African politics class, he modestly asked me, "Scott, would you have any interest in seeing my lectures?" Of course, right? And the next day, photocopies of a whole semester of his lectures were in my mailbox. In my first few years, Crawford came virtually to every single talk I did, anything I did in public, and often invited me to lunch or for a beer afterwards. And then after a little small talk, he got right to the point. So Scott, he'd ask with that sort of deeply kind grin and a slight tilt of his head, who do you think shot down Habyarimana's plane? What do you think about Paul Kagame? Is James Kabarebe really his number two? What do you think is really the relationship between Alassane Ouattara and Guillaume Soro? Do you think Katumbi could win in a fair election in the Congo? Say, Scott, do you think that Bashir is funding the Jourde, or do you think it's Salah Gauche? And then I'd also receive long emails, something usually Crawford-esque complimentary in the first sentence, and then the second sentence. Indeed, it was your presentation that brought to the surface, I'm quoting here, somewhat inchoate reflections on divergences amongst the colonizers and the modalities of understanding and interpreting African identity categories, and so on. He always had his finger on the pulse of African politics. He was always paying extremely close attention, often closer than I was in many cases. And he always asked me questions on Africa's own terms, not on US foreign policy terms. He never gossiped about department politics or the profession or what have you. He wanted always, whenever he could, to talk about African politics. Act 3, generosity. At least from my perspective, Crawford's life began to shift a little bit after his beloved Becky died, and he transitioned to a retirement community that Aili mentioned in downtown Madison called Capitol Lakes. And this was actually a period when I got to spend a little more time with him, which I cherished. And a couple of moments stand out. First, as he was packing up his house, he invited me over and said, Scott, do you want these paintings by a Congolese artist named Chibumba Kanda Matu? Knowing that I was interested in African art and insisting that these works should find a good home, he gave them to me, just a pile of canvases of paintings that were painted on the back of rice sacks, which you can see here in the background in my office, some of them. Around this time, I happened to have hip surgery, and it turned out my convalescence was in the building that Crawford was in Capitol Lakes. And that provided us with ample time to dine and drink beer together. And there I found that Crawford was very much himself, grilling me to then, this is only a couple of years ago, on the ins and outs of the latest news in African politics, but also leading a lectures committee at Capitol Lakes and otherwise seemingly to run the place from all I could tell. This is also a period when I served as associate chair of the department, and through that ran a seminar for first-year PhD students. And as Aili mentioned, Crawford wrote a massive history of our department. And he would come each year in the fall to North Hall to regale the students in the various phases and waves of the department, an analysis that echoed the periodization in his other works, on Zaire in particular. And lastly, only a few years before he died, he offered to read my entire manuscript of a book I was working on, and then wrote 10 pages of single-spaced, invaluable comments on the work. Once again, through these years, through these 15 years, never a harsh comment. Even if I could tell he didn't like something, he would usually offer something generous like, have you considered reducing some of the pages you devote to X or Y? The point here, he was a prince of a man. He was so kind, so generous of spirit and of time, so positive, so supportive, as Aili said, so smart. Act 4, memory and legacy. To get back to the question I was asked when I first started here on replacement, obviously no. But I hope that we can sustain Crawford's exceptional memory and example. He was an extraordinary scholar. He was also a truly singular colleague and mentor, someone I feel so incredibly honored and lucky to have known. In my practice, whether it's as a scholar or administrator or mentor or teacher, I will certainly try to channel the inner Crawford whenever I can. But I also wanted to mention that working together with Aili, Louise, and her sisters and the broader family, Aaliyah McCord and the African Studies program, and the university more generally, we have established a fund to support graduate students to conduct original research, field research in Africa, the M. Crawford Young Fellowship in African Politics. And this fellowship, we hope, will not only continue his legacy of supporting original field research in Africa, but also reflect and affirm the kindness and generosity that he exhibited throughout his career. We'll send along details of this later, but if any of you are able to support it, we would love that. So thank you very much. Aili, I'm not sure if you want to call in the next.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That's a lovely tribute. Thank you so much. The next, George, are you ready? I see that you joined us in between. Could you unmute your mic? The next person is George Nzongola Ntalaja.
Oh, okay.
There you
go. Yes. Well, first of all, let me thank Aili and Scott for taking the initiative in organizing this memorial session in honor of our dear, beloved professor, teacher, mentor, and friend, Crawford Young. Straus said everything that I would like to say. I don't think I have much more to add to what he said. Basically, the fact that this was a wonderful person, a very honest person, a person who was very generous, who was very much involved in whatever any of his students was doing, and who kept his counsel in a more very gentle and a nice way. I last saw him when I was invited to Madison to speak at the seminar in honor of Sharpsburg. And we had a very, very wonderful time in that old people's home close to the Capitol. And talked about, and I was really impressed to see how Crawford remained so much on top in terms of what's happening in Africa. He's a person of enormous energy and person of enormous knowledge concerning not only Africa, but the world. As a matter of fact, my coming to Wisconsin was somewhat interesting in the sense that I came to Wisconsin on the urging of Professors Rupert Emerson of Harvard University and Henry Bienen, then of Princeton University. We were at a summer seminar at the University of Kentucky, where I had been admitted in 1967 to the graduate program in the School of Diplomacy and International Commerce. And the university also gave me a fellowship for a 3-week summer seminar on foreign policy and development in developing countries with distinguished scholars from different parts of the United States and in different areas such as Africa, Latin America, and Asia. And Emerson and Bienen were the two Africanists at this meeting. So in one of the breaks, Emerson said, "But George," he said, "what are you doing in the bush?" You should be in Madison studying under Crawford Young. I said, "Yeah, professor, you Crawford Young." I wrote him a letter from Davidson College about going to Wisconsin. He didn't reply to me. He had his secretary send me a letter simply that I should apply to Department of Political Science. Emerson said, "Young man, get rid of your vanity and your pride." He said, "You should write him. Doesn't matter, whatever." He said he's very busy. He was associate dean of graduate school and head of African Studies program. So certainly there's nothing wrong in asking a secretary to write you. He said, "Okay, anyway, I'm going to write, and I'm going to ask Henry, Bienen, to write to Crawford. We want you in Wisconsin next year." Well, next year I was in Wisconsin for fellowship, course of Crawford Young as associate dean in graduate school. My years in Wisconsin were really very, very lovely. In addition to professional development, with so many distinguished professors in anthropology and history and other disciplines. There was the social gatherings at the Crawford's home with his lovely wife, Becky, and the 4 daughters, where we drank beer and ate hamburgers and discussed what was happening in Africa and so on. We learned a lot from that. In fall of 1969, I was Crawford's research assistant. And apparently I misunderstood his instructions. He asked me to do research on cultural pluralism in Dahomey, now Benin. So I went and did research, and instead of giving him research notes, I gave him a whole monograph. And they were like, I said, what is this? He said, you were supposed to give me research notes for my book on cultural pluralism. I said, well, I'm sorry, I didn't know that's what I was supposed to do. Anyway, so he sent my monograph to Belgium. It was published under my name concerning ethnicity and cultural pluralism in Benin. So that's, again, is that honesty and that generosity that Scott was talking about. In 1973, we were reunited in the Congo. He was named the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and I had just been relieved from my job as 1 year as interim associate dean of social sciences. And so for the next 4 months, I worked as Crawford's administrative assistant. What was interesting thing was that I rewrote many of the memos, and later I sent to the upper ups, to the vice chancellor and his associates, asking for all kinds of things to be done for the faculty. They never replied. Now I send these same letters under the signature of Crawford Young, and they replied to every one of them. So it was good. And when I left Lubumbashi to come to Madison to write my doctoral dissertation in 1974, 75, and I was really surprised, but very, very enjoyed by the fact that the university press called me one day to say that Crawford Young in Lubumbashi, we asked him to proofread his book, Politics of Cultural Pluralism. He said he doesn't have time in Lubumbashi to do it. He said, but there's Nzongola there. He said, you ask him to do it. And we asked him to do it. This was a great honor. I learned a lot. You know, I didn't know the Crawford Young knew so much about the rest of the world, about Europe and Asia and Latin America. So it was quite a wonderful experience for me. And of course, I really enjoyed his scholarship, his work on the Congo, which I've read in its entirety. As a matter of fact, his book, Politics in the Congo, Decolonization and Independence, is translated into French. It was used in the universities in the Congo as a textbook. Very much enjoyed. You see it cited in many publications in the Congo. And of course, his book on Politics of Cultural Pluralism, which I had the chance of proofreading, and the book that he did of Tom Turner on the rise and decline of the Haitian state, and of course, the 2 magnum opus volumes on the African colonial and post-colonial states are really books that are going to remain very, very important in the scholarship on Africa. So I'm very, very happy to join all of you in making this tribute to Crawford Young, a man of great integrity, a great scholar, and we shall certainly miss him. But we hope that everything is okay with his loved ones, and wish him that he should rest in peace. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful message, George. I just should mention that Estelle Young also joined us. I didn't realize that. It must have been in between while I was speaking. So welcome, Estelle and Louise. Our next speaker is John Harbeson, who I think was Crawford's first student, if not the first one who graduated.
Thank you, Aili, and thank you, Scott, Aili and Scott, for your opening comments. I think I was his first PhD. There's some controversy about that, but I was one of the bookends, to be sure. And one of the things that I have most appreciated, I was very lucky, is that both my undergraduate major professor at Swarthmore and Crawford were both less than a decade older than I was at the time. So that I have had the benefit of Crawford as friend, colleague, and collaborator for my entire career. And I think I've cut myself very lucky to have that experience. He was obviously very important in critical stages of my early in my career. I actually started at Wisconsin with Ari Zolberg, who then promptly left. And so Crawford came and welcomed me to the program. One thing, for example, early on, the Department of Political Science at the time were not prepared to recognize Swahili as a research language for purposes of PhD. And so it depended upon Crawford to recommend that. And so some of us, 3 or 4 of us, became the first people at the University of Wisconsin to use Swahili as the PhD language. Unknown to me, when I was starting my fieldwork in Kenya, I was on my way to Kenya through London, and he set me up as a fellow at the Institute for Development Studies in Kenya. I had no idea that he was going to do that. It just sort of happened. And not only that, but when I was in Kenya, he said, stay another year to finish your work, and I'll take care of your appointment. So Crawford actually got me my appointment at the University of Wisconsin Parkside, a brand new campus of the University of Wisconsin, unknown to me until I heard about this by almost by accident. That, of course, could not possibly happen anymore, but in each of those ways, he was really critical in the start of my career. But I like everybody else, I've greatly benefited from all his books in my own scholarship and teaching, particularly the post-colonial state book and the African colonial state book. And they continue to influence my writing. Right at the moment, I'm very concerned about what's going on in Ethiopia. So Crawford's insights about the state are very important. So they've been very important. So it's also been a real honor and a great benefit that I've had a chance to enjoy Crawford as a colleague in Jourde the edited works. And so it's great importance to me that he was in the Civil Society and the State book that Don Rothschild and Neil Mikazan and I did in the early 90s. Aili was, I think, at the point at the MacArthur Foundation, and you were critical in getting us that conference, which made the book come forward. And he's also been in all 6 editions of Don Rothschild's and my Africa and World Politics. So in all these ways, he's been terrifically important as colleague and friend, conscientious, and I think at several points in my dissertation, he wasn't really sure that I was on the right track, but he didn't come down hard on me. We basically talked about it, and he was very gracious. But I'm left with one particular parting comment that has stayed with me in every dissertation oral that I've been on ever since. When I was going in for my own defense in late '69, he said, "Well, I was nervous about the defense. Marvin Miracle and Bill Young and Dennis Rassain were on the committee along with Crawford." And he said, I was really nervous. He said, "John, think about it. This is the brightest class you're ever going to teach, so enjoy it." And I have shared that comment with every one of my undergraduate students ever since. And so with that, I'll pass the baton. And thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. I just want to mention also that we have with us today also Eva, Emily, and Crawford's brother, Ralph, and other family members who are watching via Google through Aaliyah at UW. So welcome to all of Crawford's family. I don't think that Tom Turner is here, so I'm going to move on to Joel Samoff.
Thank you, Aili. Thank you, Aili and Scott, for organizing. Like many of you who are here today, I was Crawford's academic advisee, but as I'm sure you all understand, our relationship was much more than that. He advised, he supervised, he wondered, he challenged, he reacted, and he encouraged me to follow my passions. And as Scott noted at the outset, he was a very gentle, kind, humorous person and very dedicated to students. So let me offer a few anecdotes from my experience with Crawford. When I was an undergraduate, in that very apprehension-inducing moment of applying to graduate school, one major university where I sought admission kept sending me letters that were "Dear blank." That is, the administrative machinery generated form letters and couldn't take the trouble to actually put in the name of the recipient as an applicant to the graduate program. And the contrast was the University of Wisconsin. Crawford Young wrote a very personal letter clearly familiar with my application materials, what I said about my interests and my aspirations. And it was a content-rich letter responding to my thinking, encouraging me to come to Madison. And indeed I did. I should note, though, that as I was preparing to move to Madison that next year, he then told me that he'd be away for my first year. In fact, having encouraged me he wasn't going to be there, it turned out to be a very productive involvement with South Africa that has lasted for a very long time, prompted by his temporary replacement. The general point, though, is that what Crawford Young did throughout our relationship, he was thorough and sensitive in reviewing my ideas. He directed his comments and critical challenges to me, and always in the end encouraged me to pursue my own quest. At another moment, Crawford Young was the establishment. I was at Wisconsin in some very turbulent years, 65 through 70, and the turbulence was on several fronts. At one point, the teaching assistants and research assistants were organizing to form a union and planning a strike. And in the effort to secure faculty support for that, and especially to try to shield the TAs from the university's promised very harsh response, students organized talking groups to go and talk with faculty and try to persuade them to come over to the side of the TAs. Many faculty refused to meet with those groups. Others allocated time for a brief visit with no listening and no interaction. Crawford, however, welcomed the groups, listened carefully, asked questions, and challenged assumptions. Ultimately, he didn't support the strike, but that's not my point. My point is that he made time for students, including those who claimed attention for issues that were far, far from his primary interests. And there too, as he listened and queried, he encouraged learning. As he responded, he took students as serious participants in university life and in the academic enterprise. Activist students, empowered students didn't dismay Crawford, it didn't scare him. He encouraged them, even as he disagreed. I should add a very personal note prompted by those meetings with student activists who were trying to win faculty over to the side of the TAs and the RAs. After one particularly agitated meeting, a meeting in which apparently I was far too outspoken, he commented to Rachel, then still my girlfriend, impressed by her comments and more important by her ability to corral mine, that our partnership was surely very solid. And as I sit here, he was right. There was a reference earlier to Crawford's quick movement to tenure. For those who haven't heard the story, let me tell it. This is his story about his route to the establishment. He was actually away. He was in Africa in the year prior to what would have been the tenure review year. And he had a request from his chair to send the materials for his tenure review, which in his understanding was he was sending materials so that there could be a quick start the following year to his tenure review. And as he tells the story, as he was completing his work in Africa and preparing to return to Madison, he got a letter from the chair informing him that he'd been promoted with tenure. No fuss, no muss. Times have surely changed. Crawford and I regularly disagreed. Disagreed is the focus of another story. One sunny Sunday afternoon in 1969, Crawford and I were sitting in the lounge at the Oyster Bay Hotel in Dar es Salaam, then already its former grandeur decaying sharply. He was making a site visit during my doctoral fieldwork, which was focused on the local politics of development in a country that had announced its commitment to African socialism. And initially, my research plan called for fieldwork at several sites. Indeed, I went around the country exploring alternative sites for the work that I was proposing to do. In my correspondence, and then again that afternoon, I explained why I had decided that an extended stay at a single site would be more productive than the planned multi-site research. Crawford was skeptical, emphasizing the importance of comparison and certainly downplaying the logistical problems that I had mentioned. The logistical problems, he said, are always solvable. And then he acknowledged the benefits of the greater depth, but insisted that the multi-site comparison would be a better choice. The point of the story then is that he supported me as the researcher, even though he was not fully persuaded by my research strategy. The point of the story is that he criticized, he challenged, he argued, and then he was willing indeed to accept and support my research plan.
Cool, that's right.
Disagreed is the ironic hidden text for another story. Early in my career, I was an applicant for a post at a major university. And when the chair of the search committee notified me that I'd been selected for an interview, he thought it was important to review my publication list. One article on the list, he explained to me, would not be counted because since I'd written it while I was still at Wisconsin, it was actually Crawford Young's work, not mine. So here was an article where Crawford and I had parted company. We disagreed on approach, we disagreed on conclusion. He thought I was wrong. And now the large academic world said this was not really Samoff's work, this was Crawford Young's work. We both laughed when I told him the story. Crawford Young was not a faculty member who sought acolytes or apprentices or junior copies. He valued independence and initiative. And throughout my experience with Crawford, he created space for me and others to do our work, even as we went our own ways. And for all of us as educators, that surely should be our model. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Catharine Newbury is next.
The first news of Crawford's passing came to us in an email from a colleague in Belgium. To help mitigate the shock and deep sorrow of this loss, my husband David and I shared stories of Crawford, scholar, professor, mentor, and later also friend and colleague, as so many of you have already mentioned. The nice thing about having had a relatively young professor as mentor when I was in graduate school is that there was a possibility to know him later as a friend and colleague. We regretted that we couldn't attend the memorial service in Madison. Some days later, when I tried to explain to a friend here in Vermont who Crawford was, and this is someone who is an intellectual, but not an academic nor an Africanist, I was trying to explain his role as a mentor, why it was so important to my studies and my career. I could not hold back the tears. This was when the loss really hit me. So I very much welcome the opportunity to honor Crawford at this memorial gathering. Thank you, Aili. Thank you, Scott, for organizing the panel and for hosting it. In 1966, when I arrived in Madison as an eager, if rather clueless graduate student, I didn't realize that Crawford himself had begun teaching at the university only 3 years before. Nor was it evident that years later, we in the small cohort of students studying African politics at the time would be referred to as Crawford's early graduate students. What did become clear quickly, however, is that he was a kind and thoughtful person, as well as a brilliant scholar and an inspiring professor. He was also a most helpful mentor, as so many of his former students have already expressed at this memorial. Crawford was a political scientist, but also an Africanist. He believed in the value of area studies and interdisciplinary inquiry. This was evident in the syllabi for his courses, and also his positive response when students wished to take courses in areas such as African history and anthropology, as well as language study, alongside the courses in political science. Crawford also valued fieldwork. When I stayed out in Rwanda and then Congo for almost 5 years, he didn't complain. Crawford's course on African politics was one of my first courses as a graduate student. His lecture in this course on the emergence of the Bangala ethnic identity in colonial Congo was my first introduction to the situational, contextual character of ethnicity. And it was also, of course, depicted in chapter 11 of his book, Politics in the Congo. That approach to ethnicity developed and honed in Crawford's later work, the book that Jourde tells us he proofread, was important to me in shaping the focus of my dissertation research in Rwanda. Later on in 1973, David and I were residing in Eastern Congo, while David did his dissertation research and I was writing up my dissertation. We flew to Lubumbashi for a brief visit during which we were able to see Crawford, who was then serving as Dean of Social Sciences at the university, as Jourde has already explained to us. That was very special, not least because we engaged in a friendly but lively debate with Crawford and Thomas Turner about the current state of politics in the country. I remember that the perspective of David and myself differed somewhat from that of those who focused more on the national politics. We were living at the very local level, aware of widespread rural discontent over various policies of the regime. But as others have already mentioned, Crawford was very tolerant of divergent perspectives. And that's why it was a fruitful debate and a very informative one, and it was educational. Many years later, when David and I were teaching at Smith College, Crawford and Becky came to be in residence for 10 days at the college as distinguished visitors. The visit was sponsored by the Kahn Institute at Smith in collaboration with several departments and programs. Crawford spoke to a class on Central Africa that David and I were teaching jointly that semester, a very special occasion for our students. Crawford also gave 3 public presentations, a formal lecture on democracy and the dilemmas of disorder in Africa, and he gave a more informal talk for the Kahn Institute seminar on democracy and comparative perspective. He then also spoke to the 5-college seminar in African Studies on the spread of civil disorder in Africa during the 90s, and what he saw as, and I'm quoting here, fragile but hopeful trends toward resolving the conflicts. Crawford was, as was typical for him, good at gauging the audience. His talks were well received. David and I were pleased to have the time with Crawford and Becky, and they even were able to do some sightseeing in Western Massachusetts while at Smith. I also want to mention that Becky gave a talk during their visit entitled 50 Years After Women's Suffrage, Adventures in Electoral Politics, 1970 to 1999. I found it fascinating. I had first met Becky at the kinds of gatherings at the Crawford Young's house, Crawford and Becky's house in the 60s that were mentioned by Jourde, when I knew Becky as a young mother with 4 kids, very busy with child rearing. Of course, I knew that later she had gotten into politics, but I didn't really know much about what she did. And her talk traced the trajectory of how she got into politics and eventually became a state legislator. She emphasized how important it was to have a group of women supporters through the League of Women Voters, and also why she ultimately decided not to run again after 14 years in the state legislature when politics had gotten much more partisan and divisive. As you know, Becky's role as an engaged and effective policymaker and legislator is depicted in Crawford's last book, Rebecca Young, A Life of Civic Engagement and Progressive Electoral Politics. That was truly a labor of love on Crawford's part. When David and I saw Crawford in 2016, he was working on planning, getting into the project. And when we visited him at the retirement center that several have mentioned, he wanted to show us some of the awards she'd received and some of the recognitions of her that were published during and after her lifetime, after her death. And I should mention that it was actually November 18th, 2008, just a couple of days ago, was the anniversary of her passing. Then, when we were able to see Crawford again in September 2018, it was really wonderful to see how happy he was at having completed the project. The book was in press at that time. In his book on Becky, Crawford describes her as being modest, not the kind of person who flaunted her achievements or even displayed her keen intelligence, what Crawford calls smartness. I think the same was true of Crawford. He surely took pride in his scholarship and many achievements and his students. And also I think he took pride in the things he achieved as an administrator. Yet he did not flaunt these. He was a modest man, a kind person, a dedicated scholar, and an engaged teacher. I feel so fortunate to have had him as a mentor. And I want to second what Aili said about how Crawford supported women graduate students. That was important to him. And I'm pretty sure that probably I would never have finished graduate school had I not had a mentor who did believe that women could do this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those moving comments. Our next speaker is Gretchen Bauer.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Aili and Scott for organizing. It's nice to see so many friends, and it's nice to see that Estelle is here, who was my friend when I was in grad school in Madison. So I arrived in Madison in time for the 88-89 school year. I think I had been accepted into the program because I had been a student of Michael Schatzberg's, a student of Crawford's, at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, DC. And some years before that, I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya. Crawford was immediately welcoming and wanted to know more about my experiences. That was one thing about Crawford. He wanted to learn as much from us, his students, as we were going to learn from him, our teacher. Crawford's scholarly accomplishments are legendary and have been recounted in detail here. He was a repository of so much minute information about so many people and places in Africa. One of his favorite words was masterful, and indeed he and his work were masterful. But in my brief comments, I would like to focus on Crawford Young as mentor, as others have already. Indeed, I believe that may be what I gained most from Crawford, how to be a good mentor to my own graduate students. In looking back, I see a few things I learned from Crawford Young as my mentor, about being available to one's students, respecting them, having a keen interest in them, and finally supporting them. I left grad school just as email and the internet were becoming more widely available. In my day, seeing Crawford involved climbing 4 flights of stairs to the top floor of North Hall. And he was always there and he was always available, and he at least acted happy to see us. That is a first takeaway. Second, he was deeply respectful of his students. He managed to telegraph that to us, I think also by the way in which he interacted with his family, his 4 daughters and his wife. As I noted previously, he always gave the impression that we had as much to teach him as he us. Third, he exhibited a keen interest in us as human beings, not just as students, though of course never crossing any boundaries. When I was doing dissertation research in Namibia, he visited Windhoek as a guest of the USIA, whose director he knew well. He was using the opportunity of my research and his acquaintance with Helen Picard to visit a place he had never been, to give lectures, and to convey interest and support. And finally, he was extremely supportive. I think we felt he had our backs. The summer after my first year of classes, I wanted to and did go off to Kenya for an internship with the Ford Foundation. Crawford thought I should rather be sitting in the library all summer reading, but nonetheless, he supported my decision. I remember being shocked to realize that other graduate students in the program in Madison did not have the supportive, available dissertation advisor that I had. I did not initially realize that Crawford was not the norm, far from it. Just as I am shocked today to realize that some of my own colleagues are not the supportive, available mentors to their graduate students that I think I learned to be from Crawford. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Tim Longman.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here. It's great to see so many old friends. I just wanted to mention a couple of things of what I learned from Crawford. I was at the African Studies Association meeting maybe a decade ago, shortly after Crawford had retired, when he was presenting something, and I was sitting with Greg White and Will Reno, and I think Bruce Magnuson, and maybe a couple of other folks who had studied with Crawford. And as Crawford was talking, Greg leaned over to me, and I don't remember his exact words, but it said something to the effect of, "This is really scary because I sound exactly like this in the classroom." And we all realized the ways in which our teaching reflected Crawford's approach so much. So I wanted to focus on two things that I see as a model for Crawford that people have already talked about, but one is his humility and the second is his kindness. as a grad student, one of the things that I worked with Crawford on was editing a book that came to be called Idi Amin Speaks. It was the collected speeches of Idi Amin. And I'm hoping that no one associated with this is on it, but it was really awful. It was a collection of Idi Amin's speeches that one of Crawford's former students from Makerere had put together, who had later passed from AIDS. And as a final request, his family had turned to Crawford and said, "Can you please publish this book?" Which he dutifully did. And I worked on it for a while. Everything I did, I think, was thrown out. And I think Gretchen stepped in and revised it, or maybe it was Linda Beck. I don't remember exactly who, but it went through a number of grad students. And finally, the University of Wisconsin's African Studies program published this manuscript that maybe sold 2 copies. And it was a reflection really of the devotion that Crawford showed to his students, because this was someone that he had worked with more than a decade earlier. And yet he still felt that commitment, that this was something that they had asked him to do. And because of his links to his students, he really felt that he needed to do it. One of the things that many of you were at his retirement in 2001, I was really struck by his speech at that time, because what he spoke about then was his realization of how easy he had had it. He talked about, how as it was mentioned that his tenure letter was so easy. Just oh, you got tenure, by the way. He had his choice of jobs, and he talked about having a wife who was there to follow him around and support him. And then he talked about how he had learned over the years and changed, and how having a wife who got involved in politics and having 4 daughters taught him to understand the issues that women confronted, and helped to transform him into someone who really cared about women graduate students and women in the academy. And I was struck by the extraordinary humility that he showed. And I look at myself and my own teaching and my own working with graduate students, my own working with undergrads, and I worry that I can't reflect the level of devotion and commitment, the level of kindness that Crawford showed. One of the things that a number of people have mentioned, but that as I look back, I realized really was significant. I took it very much for granted at the time, was Crawford inviting us into his home on a regular basis to meet presidents of African countries and major scholars in the field, to sit around and drink some beers and talk in a casual setting with folks who really were very important and impressive. And I realized the degree to which, I just assumed all graduate professors did that. We're always inviting students into their homes and inviting them, introducing them to presidents and things of that sort. In retrospect, I look at that and I realize that's a wonderful model for his approach to us, which is, quietly invited us into our home, introduced us to important people, made nice connections, put us in touch with people who invited us to conferences, helped us get publications out there without ever really making a big deal about it, without telling you that he'd necessarily made a phone call or sent an email to someone. So that's what I want to leave with, is just this idea that really his model is impressive in the degree to which he was thinking of us even when we weren't aware of it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tim. Now we move on to Cedric, Jourde.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Aili and Scott, for organizing this event. I'm going to time myself. Aili, you gave us 8 minutes, and it's starting now. Okay, so much has been said about Crawford by those who spoke before me and who spoke much better and eloquently than I will. It'll be hard not to repeat the same things. The depth of his knowledge, which was so impressive, un puits de science hors du commun, and the kindest and most generous scholar one could imagine. I think that with Stephanie Nanes, who's at Hofstra University, I was probably Crawford's last PhD student. I started a program at UW in the fall of 1995 and defended my dissertation in 2002, a year after Crawford had retired. There's so much I would like to say about Crawford, but I'll just mention a few stories. As an undergrad interested in African politics at the Université de Montréal, I had heard about the book he had just published a year before I graduated, which was the colonial state in the African colonial state in comparative perspective. And when I was accepted at UW, thanks to none other than Aili, to whom I will always owe a huge debt, I thought that I needed to buy the book before I meet Crawford. And after reading a few pages, I realized that this was not your usual scholar. I think I did not understand 50% of the words written in this book. And when I checked the book to prepare this little presentation, I was laughing at all the definitions of the words I did not know, which I had to write in the margins back then. And here's a sentence that gave me a lot of trouble and kind of illustrates how I felt as a Francophone. And so in the book, he said, "The naive illusions of many partisans of colonial partition, sustained by the mendacious propaganda of the more swashbuckling agents of the scramble, touting natural riches, gasping for development in the African hinterland, were soon shattered." Oh, that was really hard. And I thought, this is a very impressive book. So I was then moving to Madison, and I met Crawford on my first visit to North Hall in September of 1995. I was 22 at the time. And right away, I realized that this was a man who knew a lot about everything and yet wanted to know more. His intellectual curiosity had no limits. Recall that a few weeks later, in October of 1995, Quebec was about to have its referendum on independence. And Crawford wanted to know everything about what was going on in Quebec. So we began discussing this whole independence thing. The problem was that I could barely answer any of his questions because I knew so little about my own province and country compared to what he knew about them. I was the one who should have been asking questions to him about Quebec and Canada. And then I remember we were talking about my doctoral project, which was about ethnicity in Senegal and Mauritania. And as we were talking, he stood up, disappeared under a table that was standing between his desk and one of his bookshelves, crawling under the table, reappearing on the other hand, and began picking books about Senegal and a few on Mauritania that existed, asking me if I had read this book and that book and this book, all in French, of course. And of course, I had not read any of these books, and I realized that the learning curve was going to be quite steep. I should also say that Crawford offered me a research assistantship. And here again, I understood that the Mount Everest-esque magnitude of his knowledge when he told me about the research task that I had to undertake for him. He had just begun working on his post-colonial state in Africa project, and he told me that he wanted me to write detailed briefs or reports on every single, on all 54 African states and how each of them were dealing with the whole democratization process. It took me about a year to do that. And of course, in hindsight, I think that he probably never needed all that stuff, but he must have thought that it would be the most efficient way for me to learn about African politics. I also TA'd for him, and this is when I realized that although he can be the nicest person on earth, he could also be tough. He never negotiated any grade with an undergrad. And here's an email I found from 1999 after I had marked exams and papers for his class. And it was written in the purest Crawford style. So he sends me this email. "For your distant amusement, Cedric, I am forwarding a couple of messages from malcontent students whose semester grade deteriorated on the basis of a final exam performance well below their earlier outcomes. In each of these cases, my offer of a conversation was not pursued once I provided them with the grim mathematical facts." End of the story. Nobody else asked for a change of their mark or grade. I then left for more than a year to do fieldwork in Mauritania in 1999 and 2000, and I found my very first email exchange with Crawford when I was in Nouakchott. And so in this first email, I wrote jokingly that the political reality in Mauritania refuses to look like what my dissertation proposal said about it, to which he replied, Cedric, welcome to the club of scholars who amend their dissertation proposals in the field. The membership includes almost all Africanists I know. And in response to my comment about how the heat waves in Mauritania and the frequent sandstorms were quite harsh and impressive, he replied, "In your spare time, you might identify some vacant sand dunes in the vicinity on which you can take an option. Think of the fortune to be made selling Nouakchott vacation property in Quebec." That was all the support I got from him for confronting those heat waves. Finally, the last time I saw him was in 2017. The ASA conference was in Chicago, and I decided to take the time to travel to Madison. And Aili was so kind and hosted me, and we organized a breakfast with her, Michael Schatzberg, and Crawford. And it was a wonderful Sunday morning with the three members of my dissertation committee. And I will certainly keep this very, very sweet memory at the bottom of my heart. And I will miss Crawford very strongly. Mon cher professeur, merci, et je ne vous oublierai jamais. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Cedric. That was very, very touching. Now we can open it up for if others want to say a few words, and then I'll read a praise poem at the end before we close. So are there others who would like to jump in?
I'll tell one brief story.
Oh, hi.
So I'll keep it very brief. Yeah, Steve Orvis, good to see everyone. Thank you so much for organizing it, Aili. This is actually not about me, it's about my wife. Those in my cohort from the 80s know that my wife was also a PhD student in North Hall. Unfortunately, she did not have a mentor as kind and generous and helpful as we all had, quite the opposite. And her dissertation committee was pretty much a nightmare. And towards the very end, just a couple of months before her defense, one person on her committee, I can't remember why, had to back out completely. And she was like, "Oh my God, what do I do now?" And I immediately said, "Ask Crawford." She's in a totally different field. I said, "He will do it. He'll do it well and thoroughly, take it seriously, and he'll be the resident sane person in the room." And that's when you need a resident sane person. And that's exactly what happened. And I've always greatly appreciated that. His kindness was just astounding. I mean, he knew her, but she wasn't his student at all. And he just stepped in at the last minute, gave a very thorough read to her entire dissertation in a field far from his own, and was supportive, as he always was.
Thank you. Thomas Wolf?
Tom, yes, thanks very much.
Oh, good.
Thanks for putting this together, the distances that we are. I had 14 days, 2 fascinating and extremely stimulating weeks with Crawford here in Nairobi in 1996. Of course, I heard him perform on various occasions at ASA and was always in awe, as all of you have said, at the breadth of his understanding and the depth of his knowledge in so many areas. But he came out to Nairobi to do a conflict assessment on Kenya for USAID. And I had been hired after leaving the University of Nairobi to be their governance and democracy advisor. But because of the Clinton budget deal, there was a freeze on hiring. So my actual hiring with USAID had been put off for 4 or 5 months, but I got a call from the deputy USAID director, again, apologizing for not being able to bring me in and have me start my work. But she said, "Have you ever heard of this professor from the University of Wisconsin, Crawford Young? He's coming out next week to do a 2-week conflict assessment of Kenya, and you might want to tag along with him." And I said, "Well, would he be willing to have somebody like me get in his way?" She said, "Well, when he comes in, we'll ask him." And I don't think Crawford had ever noticed me at ASA. He may have heard a couple of my presentations, I'm not sure. But anyway, we had these absolutely wonderful 2 weeks together where even though I'd been in Kenya already at that time for about 20 years, he just, as we heard a minute ago from Cedric about Quebec, the questions he asked after every person we interviewed or before we were going to interview with either civil society people or government of Kenyan people or ordinary Kenyans, would ask me 15, 20, 30 questions, most of which I had no clue of how to answer. And so it was just an absolutely wonderful experience. A few years later, my niece went to Madison as an undergrad, and I came over on several occasions, and he and Michael Schatzberg had me give presentations on Kenya. And at one of them, he gave me a signed copy of the colonial state with a very nice inscription saying, "Thanks again for the Kenyan seminar you gave me in 1996. So he's just somebody we'll never forget. Thank you.
Thank you. George?
Yes, Joel spoke about the teaching assistant strike of 1970. I was a member of the Teaching Assistants Association, the first union of university teaching assistants anywhere in the world. And I participated in the strike of 1970 at a time when my wife had just had our first baby on January 30th, 1970. And 2 weeks later, I was willing to give up my little salary as teaching assistant to go on strike. And Crawford sent me a message that he doesn't think it's a good idea for me to be on strike, especially being a foreign student, that I could be deported. So I told him that no, I'm a member of the union and I have to go by what the union decided. In his book on Becky, he wrote about that episode about the teaching assistant strike. And I wrote him to tell him that his version of the strike is not really totally correct from what I remember as a participant. And he was very, very kind enough to say, yes, certainly his point of view comes from the reports that the university people told them. So that I, as being a participant, had a better knowledge of what happened than was the university administrators were writing to the upper ups in the university system. So that again is so in spite of the fact that we have the differences, that does not affect our relationships. And of course, Crawford remained toujours very humble and accepting that he could be wrong.
Thank you. Are there other people who would like to say a few words? I can't see most of the people, so if you wish to speak, you'll have to somehow let me know. Oh, Frida, okay. Go ahead, Frida. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, so thank you for organizing this, first of all. And secondly, I'd like to say that, well, when I came to the University of Wisconsin as a graduate student, of course, Crawford was here. Later on, I became a member of the Faculty in African American Studies, and then also, of course, with Afro-American Studies, since I was teaching African and African American art history. So Crawford, as you know, collects African art. He has a beautiful collection of work for Congo contemporary art and, of course, more traditional arts. And so when I organized exhibitions back in the early days, the earliest show that I curated in 1976 was contemporary African art. And he was so generous, he and his wife, Rebecca, were so generous in allowing me to borrow those works. And so we've had this great relationship where he, Jan Dancina, show up, and the other greats of African studies were very supportive of African American studies as we were going through our growing pains. And that was so important because not all African and African American studies departments and programs get along well. Well, we did here because of the dynamic leadership that they pioneered here. And so the last time I met with Crawford, he was curating his own exhibition of his work over at the senior home where he was living. And he sent me a text and asked me to come over. I went over and we talked a little bit about the works that he was going to organize and display for the people there. So that was really, really exciting. So I think that's all I want to say about him in terms of him being a great political scientist and also historian and collector of art, I want to make sure that you also understand that he was such a great supporter of African American studies, as well as a collector of contemporary and traditional art. Thank you.
Thank you, Frida. Ed Keller will be next. Can you unmute?
All right.
There you go.
I arrived in Madison in political science in 1969. I was coming from New Orleans. The country, 1968 was a very memorable year all over the world, actually. But in the South, it was the first period in which there were uprisings on different campuses, some historically Black campuses, others that were being integrated, so to speak. And I came from the University of New Orleans. When I went, when I journeyed to Madison, I had spent 3 years in the U.S. Army and came back and finished my undergraduate degree in 3 more years, and became involved in the student movement in the South, so to speak. At that time, in terms of studying political science, I was mainly interested in what wasn't a formed discipline, but there were inklings of it, Black politics, urban politics. And so when I went to Madison, that's what I wanted to study. So in 69 and 70, I didn't know much about Africa. I became attracted to it when I started meeting all these heroes coming back from the field, having done their work under Crawford and the crew of really impressive scholars that were in Madison at the time. Met John Harbeson, met Joe Samoff, met Catharine Newbury, Nzongola Ntalaja. And, basically, apart from the courses, that basically hooked me. But during that whole period, 69, I graduated, I got my PhD in 74. Crawford was gone most of the time. When he was around, he was very available and helped me along and piqued my interest in African politics. At the time, there were 3 Africanists in the department, Crawford, Dennis Dresang, and Fred Hayward. So, with him traveling between Madison and Lubumbashi and being chair of the department, I had to sort of pick my opportunities to get a chance to benefit from his tutelage. But in fact, I did do that. And I was all poised to go to Uganda in 1972 when Idi Amin began acting up, and I had to change my topic. But at the same time, Crawford was heading off to Lubumbashi to become the dean, and Nzongola wasn't there. And so I ended up switching my project to do education policy in Kenya. But, it was fortuitous because it got me deeply involved in understanding all aspects of African politics and African cultures and so forth and so on. And that basically has been my career. When I went there, we used to say there was one other Black person, that African-American student that was in the program, but was gone for a time. That was K.C. Morrison, who had come from Tougaloo College in Mississippi. And during the year I arrived, he was back in Mississippi teaching at Tougaloo, but still in the program. But in any case, that's how it all began for me. Crawford was there. He really mentored me in ways I can't even describe. On the campus, you know, you might say Madison was a full participant in the days of rage, you know, and this military background, black kid from Louisiana ended up learning about the politics of the world, and that experience, along with people like Crawford and Dennis Strissang and all of the stars, you know, the stars you can think of, Aiden Southall, Marvin Miracle, and you know, a whole bunch. I can't name them all, but they were inspired me along the way. I actually met Frida during that period as well, and some of my closest friends during that period. But that's what I remember about being around Crawford during that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Will Reno.
Okay, thank you, Aili. I'll just keep my comments really brief. And just to reiterate something that a lot of other people have said about Crawford being a model. You know, I'm not sure I would have survived as a political scientist without Crawford. You know, I arrived in a place to do research about something that was very different than what my dissertation turned out to be. And the fact that I could make that adjustment, I think Tim Longman, I mean, you shared some of that same experience. The country that you went to turned out not to be the country that you thought it would be, or the rest of the world thought it would be. Those events, they intervene. And when I look at academia and academics, a lot of times I think that to have that flexibility, to have that sort of common sense, practical approach to try to help people get through that, and you know, to really become the best student or the best academic that they can be. I mean, that was Crawford's gift to me, and I think to a lot of other people. And as a consequence, in my career as an academic and the other things that I do, he's been one of the most influential models, I think, in my life. Because he's had such a great impact on me. And then, you know, for us who become mentors to other people, we realize the responsibility that we have. And that's when I think of Crawford. So when I think of Crawford, I think of humility. And what I mean by that is that he would learn from others. And, you know, we've heard that, I think, in a lot of these comments here. And he also had an accurate sense of self-awareness, and as a consequence, I would put in brackets, somewhat rare, maybe in the academic world, a good sense of self-awareness. And so what that meant was that he always had concern for other people, and it was always about other people. It was never about him. I mean, there wasn't an ounce of self-promotion. I mean, in my view, he didn't need to. But that is the authority. That is the respect that he had, that he was such a humble man. So, you know, when I think of him, that's how I would praise him. And that's a very hard quality, I think, for people to capture, and you know, I think it's very unusual to see that in people in positions of authority, and I very much respected him for that. And you know, I really think that he was just wait a minute. Okay, well, that's
Will, I wanted you to tell the story of when he came to visit, when you and Sariba Sila met in Guinea with Crawford.
Sorry, I'm preoccupied. What was that again, Tim?
I love the story of when you and Sariba Sila and Crawford Young met in Guinea while you were doing your field work.
Oh God, I was so exhausted. It was, I was kind of a refugee from. Wait, I'm really I'm getting pulled in other directions here. I'll get back to you, Tim. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Will. That was very very lovely, and very, yeah, just really rang very true to how I knew Crawford. Yeah, Jeff Paler will be next. There you are. Could you unmute yourself? We can't hear you. Or put the sound up maybe. I can't hear it. Oh, sorry. Okay, now, no, okay. All right. Well, maybe we'll try a little in a minute with both Will and with Jeff if things work out. So in the meantime, I'm going to just end my part here and with a small praise poem, which I had read at his retirement, but I read it again and it still rings very true, even 20 years after he retired. So for many years, I studied Crawford most assiduously, for he was a man who worked prodigiously, but how he did it left most of us puzzled, and even I myself was quite befuddled. Should you have walked by North Hall on Friday night, you would have seen at his window a burning light. But if he was not to be found in his office, no doubt he was in Lagos, Kampala, or Paris. The breadth of his expertise boggled the mind. The scope of his interests made him one of a kind. If it was Mongol-Kazakh conflicts, to Crawford we referred, or campus parking dilemmas, to him we most certainly deferred. If you needed to know about civil society in Ouagadougou, or elections in Cotonou, or even militarism among the Karamojong, it is surely to Crawford you would run. One needed only to ask him about Rondé's scores, and he would hold forth on them and so much more. But should you have mentioned Becky's political opponents, this would have roiled him in less than a few moments. When it came to the African state, we all know Crawford's work was stellar, first rate. Was the state integral or neo-patrimonial? Was the state illegitimate or just developing late? It was to Crawford you would go if this is what you wanted to know. Our students learned much from this esteemed prof, for every one of them with ease could rattle off a primordial, constructivist, and instrumental approach, and could expound on them without reproach. Crawford was a man of diplomatic disposition who shunned all forms of faculty friction. Hours with him were most enlightening, especially on Badger bleachers or imbibing. Today we remember this man so dear, an intellectual giant, it was clear, but mostly we were fortunate to have known the wisdom, humility, and kindness he had shown. So that's it, unless somebody else still wants to chime in. Thank you. All right. So don't forget, we have this we have this conference we're planning for April 1st next year. We'll be letting you know about it. And if you would need, I see some people have posted their email address. I have most of you on my list, but if you aren't on my list for this memorial, I'm glad to take your contact information for that conference.
I have one question, Aili.
Yeah, sure.
Any of you ever have a discussion in the last couple of years with Crawford about President Trump?
Yes.
Do you have any, wonder what he had to say about that?
You can only imagine. I don't know, do you want to say something?
No,
we had a lot of conversations about politics.
I wonder what he would be saying about the state of American democracy today.
Oh, yeah.
We'll miss him.
Yes,
thank you
we
all
will.
so very much.
Yes, thank you. And Scott, do you want to say anything, any last closing words?
No, thank you so much for everyone who made such incredibly moving comments. And I did want to just to acknowledge Crawford's family who's here as participants, and I think through various other mechanisms. And what an incredible man and an incredible mentor and friend and colleague and teacher, administrator and father from and husband from all that I know. And so we've all been so lucky to be touched by him. And thank you all for sharing these memories today.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Aili and Scott.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for all the tributes. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, clerk. I just will take this down. Clerk.